It was a quiet evening, the kind that presses against you with a stillness so thick you can feel it in your bones. The countryside stretched out like a faded painting, muted greens bleeding into greys, the horizon swallowed by a heavy sky. An old house sat crooked on a hill, its wooden frame groaning under decades of wind and rain, the shingles peeling like skin from a forgotten wound. The air carried the damp scent of earth, moss, and something sharper, something restless. The wind moved through the trees, not with a howl, but with a low, persistent hum, brushing the leaves into a chorus that felt almost alive. Inside that house she stood, Clara, 29, a painter with hands stained by years of color and a heart frayed by the noise of the city. She'd come here for silence, for solitude, to mend herself in the quiet of these walls. But the wind, it seems, had other plans. I watched her from the edges, where the shadows pool deep and the world blurs into something less certain. She moved through the house with a careful step, her boots scuffing the warped floorboards as she unpacked her brushes and canvases. The windows rattled faintly in their frames, a rhythm she barely noticed at first. She'd chosen this place for its isolation, a refuge from the clamor of deadlines and crowded streets. The hill rose steep behind the house, its slopes scarred with old mud trails, a silent witness to storms long past. Clara didn't know it yet, but that hill was more than a backdrop. It was a player in the story unfolding around her. Then it came, a leaf, brittle and yellowed, carried by a sudden gust that pressed it flat against the kitchen window. It stuck, there, trembling in the fading light, its edges curling inward around a strange scribble, like a frantic mark scratched in haste. Clara paused, her brush hovering over a half-empty box. She crossed the room, the floor creaking under her weight, and plucked the leaf from the glass. It was cold, unnaturally so, its veins brittle against her fingertips. She held it up, squinting, at the jagged lines, 3 slashes, a curve, a mess of ink that made no sense, a warning, a child's doodle. She couldn't tell. The wind outside picked up, tugging at the trees, and for a moment she thought she heard a whisper in its hum, a sound too soft, too fleeting to catch. With a shake of her head, she set the leaf on the table beside a chipped teacup and turned away, the echo of that gust fading into the dusk. You're in Tales of the Watcher, where fates are glimpsed, not told, and every step you take is seen by eyes you'll never meet. The air hums with secrets, daring you to listen. Stick around, subscribe for the journey, and in today's story, the wind carried more than just leaves. The night settled heavy over the house, the kind of darkness that swallows edges and turns familiar shapes into strangers. Clara tried to sleep, her new bed creaking under her restless turns. The wind hadn't stopped. It wove through the trees, a constant murmur that seeped into the walls. She dreamed then, fitful and fragmented. She saw the hill shift, its soil spilling downward in a slow, dark wave, roots snapping like threads, the earth groaning as it devoured the valley below. She stood in the dream, her feet rooted to the porch, watching as the house trembled but held. She woke with a gasp, her breath sharp in the cold room, the silence now absolute. The clock on the wall read 2:13 a.m., its second hand ticking with a steadiness that mocked her racing pulse. She stumbled to the kitchen, the leaf still there on the table, unchanged but somehow heavier in the dim light of a flickering bulb. Her hand shook as she traced the scribble again, the lines stark against the yellowed surface. Was it the dream? The wind? Something in her stirred. Doubt, yes, but also a flicker of curiosity she couldn't shake. She poured water into the teacup, the steam rising in faint curls, and sat there staring out at the hill through the window. It loomed in the moonlight, its scars more visible now, etched deep from rains she'd never seen. The wind returned, softer this time, brushing the glass with a sigh. Clara sipped her tea, the warmth grounding her, but the unease clung like damp air on her skin. Morning came grey and slow, the sky a blanket of clouds that pressed the world flat. Clara lingered by the window, the leaf back in her hands. She turned it over, studying it as if it might speak. The slashes, the curve, they tugged at her painters, a pattern she couldn't place. She stepped outside, the air cool and thick, her boots sinking into the soft earth of the yard. The hill rose before her, its slope steeper up close, the grass patchy where old mud had carved its paths. She held the leaf up, aligning it with the ridge. The curve matched, too perfectly. The slashes pointed downhill toward the narrow road that snaked through the valley, the one she'd planned to take into town later that day. Her breath caught, a chill creeping up her spine. She went back inside, pacing the creaky floor, the leaf clutched tight. It was nothing, she told herself, a trick of the mind, a sleepless night playing games. But then she heard it, a low rumble, faint like thunder sleeping deep under the earth. The wind picked up, sharper now, rattling the windows with a force that made her jump. Outside, a neighbor's dog began to bark, its cries cutting through the morning haze. Clara's stomach twisted. She grabbed her phone. No signal, just static on the weather app. The rumble grew, a vibration she felt in her chest, and the trees bent under the wind's sudden fury. She ran to the porch, her eyes fixed on the hill. The scribble burned in her memory. 3 slashes, a curve, a map she hadn't wanted to read. The hill seemed to shift then, a trick of the light or something more. A shadow moved along its edge, not a cloud, not the wind, but something alive in the earth itself. The dog's barks turned to howls, and Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. She thought of the dream, the soil spilling, the house trembling. The road below was her only way out. Her car parked just beyond the porch. Stay or go. The wind roared, tugging at her jacket, and the rumble swelled, no longer distant, but close, too close. She clutched the leaf, its edges crumbling in her fist. Instinct overtook doubt. She turned, sprinting back inside, slamming the door as the world outside began to break. The earth roared, a sound so deep it shook the walls, a cascade of mud and stone tearing down the hill in a choking wave. Clara pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass, watching as the landslide swallowed the road below, uprooting trees, burying the path she'd nearly taken. Dust rose in thick clouds, the wind carrying it against the house like a shroud. The rumble faded, slow and reluctant, leaving a silence that pressed heavier than the noise. She slid to the floor, her legs weak, her hands trembling as she let the leaf fall. It wasn't a doodle, it was a warning, an echo of something she'd almost ignored. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Clara stayed in the house, her brushes untouched, her eyes darting to the hill every time the wind stirred. She'd survived, but the weight of it lingered, a secret she couldn't paint away. The leaf was gone, swept off by the gusts that had brought it, but its lines stayed with her, etched into her mind like a scar. She began to notice things, the way the wind seemed to pause before a storm, the way the hill's shadow fell longer than it should. She wondered who'd scratched that warning, who'd known what she hadn't. I watched her from the trees where the shadows pool deep and the air hums with what's unseen. She didn't see me, of course. Few ever do. The wind had spoken, and she'd listened just this once. But the story wasn't hers alone. One evening, as Clara sat by the fire, a knock rattled the door. She opened it to find a neighbor, old, weathered, his hands rough from years in the soil. He held out a folded paper, creased and yellowed, marked with the same jagged scribble. Found it in "The shed," he said, his voice low, his eyes flickering with something unspoken. Clara took it, her fingers steady now, and nodded. The wind picked up outside, a soft murmur against the walls, and I stepped back into the dark. She unfolded the map later, tracing its lines with a painter's care. It wasn't just the hill. It marked the valley, the river, places she'd never been. She set it beside her canvas, a new weight settling in her chest. The wind had carried one warning, but this was something more. Another tenant for this house. Another thread in my sight. I tilted my head, the shadows shifting around me, and waited. This is Tales of the Watcher, where shadows tell what. Eyes can't see. Who scratched those lines? The wind might know, or perhaps it's whispering to someone else now. Stay with us. The next thread is never far.